Well, just wanted to give you a update a little bit instead of just writing a normal prayer update of this in this video of what God's kind of been doing in our lives the last 9 months. A lot of you know that Angie and I graduated from Tabor College in '98, and it's a Mennonite Brethren school. And Angie and I really grew up both in kind of that Mennonite culture, but also in Anabaptist faith. But serving with World Impact for 18 years, we in Lighthouse, that was a Mennonite Brethren church, but these last 10 years hadn't really been as connected to our Mennonite friends and family. But once we left World Impact to join Disciple Nations, the Lord started bringing us back into our family with our Mennonite Brethren. And really that started with Mennonite Brethren Mission, doing some equipping out at Oasis with our good friends Bob and Kel Pankratz. Through that, we got to know some students at Tabor and a few friends in Hillsboro. And so then this past year, in August, I was invited to speak at Tabor at their opening, kind of just a discipleship for students as they came on campus. And while I spoke that weekend, I was, just as I was in the cafeteria, and there's many students I saw that did not know the Lord, there for athletes or for various reasons. And as I spoke and as my heart's really been burdened for revival and to see the next generation follow Jesus and going to the nations, my heart was deeply burdened that weekend for Tabor. And so I challenged the students that weekend, what if we started praying for God to move at Tabor, and what if just to be bold in our faith? And there was just 10 or 15 of us, but I think God did something in my heart for sure, also in those students. The next piece came in October. I was in a prayer meeting with a couple friends, and as I was praying, one of my friends, she just heard, and she said, "Matthew, I think the Lord's asking you to start praying into a certain country." At the time, I had just learned my Mennonite, there were some new Mennonite Brethren churches being formed in Ukraine. So let me pause and just share quickly what the Mennonites are. Some of you know that, you support us, or you know who the Mennonites are, but for those of you may think, when you think of Mennonites, you may think of Caps or people that are riding in horse and buggies, but the Mennonites really came out of the Reformation in the 1500s, as they were radical disciples, and the distinction were a couple things. You have radical disciples and really a rebaptism, a believer's baptism. And out of that choice to be rebaptized, kind of be against culture, they faced lots of persecution. And so they were farmers, they were really poor. They went from Prussia and Poland. But then in the late 1700s, Catherine the Great invited them into what is now Ukraine. And so they spent 100 years in that area developing the Turkey red weed. And in 1860, it was then the Mennonite Brethren really was formed as there was a revival, as they rediscovered again the Bible and this radical commitment to discipleship and being on mission. And so out of that, then in 1874, they came to Kansas, and that was some of my family. And finding out my fifth generation grandpa was one of the first settlers to Marion County, where Hillsboro and Tabor is. So in that, back to this prayer meeting, I had heard again that God was bringing some Mennonite Brethren churches in Ukraine. And so when my friend said, "Matthew, I think the Lord's asking you to pray into a country," immediately my heart kind of burned. I thought, God, is this Ukraine? Are you asking me to start praying into Ukraine? And later that afternoon, I was praying again, and this verse came to me out of a book. In Genesis 26:17, it says, "So Isaac moved away from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar, where he settled. And Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham, which the Philistines had stopped after the Abraham had died, and he gave them the same names as his father had given them." And just this idea that wells represent the presence of God, represent where God has moved, represent life. There had been wells in Ukraine where God had moved for a century really. And God had birthed this movement of the Mennonite Brethren. But when they came, and then we know as communism came in a sense, the enemy had covered up, had put dirt in that well. But it was like in the last 10 years, life is coming back in the Mennonite Brethren in that same area. And so I just started to burn with that story and reconnected with some friends, Jesse and Tara Allen, who just had graduated from Tabor, had been on mission recently in the last year. I shared this story of the wells, and they were touched with that as well. And we started praying, does God perhaps want us to go to Ukraine? And quickly, a couple weeks later, we met the couple, Max and Anya, from Ukraine, and they were interested in having a summer team come. And so we shared this idea of praying with them. And so all of a sudden we found on a team going to Ukraine this summer. And so there's a team of 6, my own daughter's going. And so that's been one part of this story of these wells. It's just been amazing as we've shared this story with churches in Hillsboro and others, just to see the generosity of many of praying and giving into us this trip. So we'll be going this July to Ukraine, working with camps, working with these churches of 8 to 10, and believing that God, again, wants to bring revival to this land that's been just decimated by violence and by despair. So that's one part. But then this past spring, I was invited to speak at Tabor and Chapel, and just felt the Lord say, why don't you go on campus every single Wednesday just to pray and follow relationships that you know. At the same time, the Tabor had moved into their new music building, and in Chapel, they noticed that God was starting to move. In Chapels, students were giving their lives to the Lord. They had several students rededicate their lives to the Lord. It seemed that God was breathing new life at Tabor. And I just felt, again, from this probably fall, that initial spark, as I just started praying and connecting with some of the RDs, connecting with the campus pastor, and we just sensed God was doing something new at Tabor. So I was just faithful every week to meet with student leaders, sharing, and just really felt my heart touched by Hillsboro. One of the things that Disciple Nations is committed to is making disciples in the nations, and committed to radical prayer, radical discipleship, and it really fits the heart of the Anabaptist, that original heart from 400 years ago, and the original heart of my Mennonite brother and family from 1816. So it just seemed like, wow, I've always moved or had a heart for the inner city, that suddenly God was giving me a heart for Marion County, and a heart for Hillsboro, and a heart for Tabor. And so just as in that faithfulness, God just opened doors for discipleship. And so I just wanted to share a couple quick stories of what God did these last few weeks. So one of the things that there are many urban students on that campus. They're there to play baseball or play football. And so my heart, being in the inner city for 17 years, is just loves the fact that there's many students on that campus from cities in America. And so as I met with the campus leaders a couple weeks ago, one of the things I found out was that they didn't really know of one leader that really was from the football or from the kind of that urban crowd that was really following the Lord in a strong way and being a leader on campus. And so literally 2 hours later, I was walking, and I had been praying for a divine appointment for an urban student. Been praying because I can't reach. I'm not on the football team. I'm not a student there. But just saying, God, is there one student perhaps that you would want me to invest in? And so I'm walking, and there I meet this one student. I think our eyes just met. We'd maybe met before in a few weeks. And just something drew us together, and we kind of gave a big hug to each other. And I just started talking with him and found out he's from LA, and I was joking with him about the nightlife at Hillsboro and all the fun activities in this small town, and we were just joking and just kind of quickly made a rapport together, just could tell we were enjoying being together. And I just said, hey, would you ever want to meet together? I'd love to just hear your story. He said he would love to do that. So we agreed to do that. And before I got done meeting, I said, hey, what's your name? And he said his name was Caleb Devine. In fact, Jesus was kind of messing with me and saying, not only is this your divine appointment, but his last name is Divine. And so we met the following week. And just as I heard his story, I found out his dad is a pastor. His mom is an evangelist. And I'm thinking, Lord, of all the people you could have led me to, you led me to a guy, his name's Divine. He has, I think, divine appointments on this campus to be a leader. And so as we met, just the Spirit of God came on me, and I was able to encourage him. I said, Caleb, what if you're here more than just to be an athlete? That God's calling you to be a leader. And he just looked, and I could tell that really impacted him. And we've already been talking some. I encouraged him just to pray this summer for God, just to give him students that he could invest in already this fall on the football team. So that was one story. The same day, I was on the phone, and I wear earbuds. And when I'm on the phone, I often pace back and forth. And I was aware of this student kind of looking at me and was trying not to talk too loud, but that probably was probably was talking as just, I have a loud voice. And so I get off the phone, and I was talking with my friend Bob, and we were talking about the Lord, and he kind of was looking at me. So I went up to this young man and said, "Hey, how are you doing?" And got his name, and found out he's graduating soon at Tabor, and asked him how he was doing. And he said, "Actually, I'm not ready to face the real world." He was faced with some fear, and he was nervous about all that. And so we just started talking. He said, "Hey, can I ask you a couple questions?" And those questions led to about a 45-minute conversation about God. And he had lots of questions. He had been interested in the Lord often, but often had fell back and had just struggled with different things. And so it was just pretty clear that God was working on his heart. And so as he got my number, and we texted the next day or two, and I prayed, and he even asked if God was really real and after him, that there would be another divine appointment or another encounter. And so 2 days later, it's on a Friday, I text him, and "How are you doing?" He said, "Well, in fact, I'm sitting at a Walmart here, and I happen to be by another pastor, and he's sharing his faith with me just like he did with you. But what was cool," he said, "he had a really hard background with addiction and some struggles, and just like me, he was able to share how inviting Jesus in his life had helped him overcome that." And so I said, "See, God is after you." And he said, "I know he is." But his last text was, "I just don't see how a person could forgive me. You see, no one human would ever forgive of some of the things I've tried to follow God and fallen back." And so I said, "Well, yeah, that's the beauty of the gospel, and that God isn't human, but Jesus came as a human, as fully God and fully man." And so just shared a little bit more over Scripture. And so we agreed to get together. So this past week we met. It's 3 days before his graduation. And he just was open and wanted me to share the gospel with him. And again, shared scriptures and shared stories. And he had a couple different questions. We got through those hurdles. And it was clear the Lord was inviting him into salvation. And so we prayed and got the campus pastor there. And as we prayed, I asked him, "What's going on?" And he just smiled and he said, "I don't know. It's like I'm clear. My mind's not blank," he said, "but it's just everything's clear." And he felt happy inside. He felt the Lord, and we talked about what it means to be filled with his presence. And so just believing as this man leaves Tabor 3 days before graduation that he found God and found a relationship. And so we'll work on following up with him. And so that's what I've sensed as I've been at Tabor, that God's moving on students, that he wants to equip students, some that don't know him and others that do. And so as my heart is in discipleship and in prayer, I don't know what God has in the next months and this year, but I just believe through Ukraine as we go and we pray and we redig these wells, that God will move in Ukraine, but also back in Hillsboro where since 1874 there's been a Mennonite brethren presence, just believing as God moves that again he's going to reach the nations for him. So just want to thank you for those that have prayed and are sowing into us, partnering with through prayer and your finances. And just as we go to Ukraine, just pray. My friend talked with the leader there, and he just said the people are depressed, they're broken, especially since Russia invaded 5 years ago, that there's lots of brokenness. So he said you're going to really need the power of God. So pray that we would carry the true hope of Jesus through us, that we would be able to impact lives with joy and with his presence and sharing him, impacting the church, sharing. And so just, pray with us as our team, and then just pray as I pray, as we talk with leaders, what does discipleship and equipping look like at Tabor, and how do we continue to train students? Thank you for joining us in prayer.